Hello and welcome to Roguelike Radio, the procedurally generated podcast where all of the participants eventually die. Joining me today to talk about AI and PCG, we have...
I'm Tommy Thompson. I'm a senior lecturer, game developer, and the voice of the AI and Games YouTube channel.
I'm Brian Bucklew. I'm one of the developers of Caves of Qud.
And I'm Mark Johnson. I'm a games researcher and I make Ultra Moratio Regum. So, fantastic. Thank you both for joining me here today. So, to start off, could you both say a little bit about your kind of background with AI and how you got into this field?
So I came in from the kind of pure academic route, I guess. I started out doing machine learning for non-player character research about, this would have been about, I'm feeling old. This would be over 10 years ago now. I did my undergraduate degree, I did computer science, and I did a bit of machine learning for non-player character control, and then sort of continued to do that. I went on, did a master's degree in that field at Edinburgh University, and then did my PhD in that area. And sort of the last 5-6 years of my life has been a mixture of being a games researcher and migrating into not just kind of traditional AI, but also looking at PCG research applications, and then slowly kind of getting into my own game development as well. And now in a larger way, I kind of spend a lot of time talking about what other people do with AI and games, where I'm kind of looking at what academics are doing and what the games industry is doing in terms of AI, and kind of trying to share that to a wider audience. So I've kind of, the longer it's went on, I've kind of went into these kind of disparate but kind of interlinked areas.
I have much less academic credentialing than Tommy. I'm a high school dropout that was a hobbyist game dev for many years and read everything I could get my hands on about game development, including Tommy's book. And spent 20 years outside of games and started Caves of Qud and had to put a lot of work into getting AI to work around procedural generation in Caves of Qud. And so at this point, I've been doing it for 10 plus years and have something that kind of works in practice. So hopefully I can give a sort of ground level view of AI while Tommy tells you how it actually works.
That's fantastic. Thanks, guys. So, when it comes to linking up AI and PCG, do you think that there are kind of particular challenges for making AI with PCG games?
Well, I think, Brian, I should defer to you in this instance, because you've probably spent the most time actually working on this problem.
Well, the biggest challenge, at least in the context of Caves of Qud, which I can speak to, is that Caves of Qud provides very mutable environments and very mutable characters. So there's no real ability to do some of the pre-processing that large open world games tend to do with their environments. So the AI has to be reactive to an environment that can like turn into lava, or in one case be a very small area, and in a second case be a very large area filled with angry banana trees, and in some cases the AI can fly or it can't, or it is an angry banana tree, or it's a sentient wall, and all of those things have to be dealt with in a way that's reasonable. Like how does a wall work when it's animated and fun to play, right? Because we're not just about getting it a simulative thing. We want the player to be able to sit down and actually play with it. And so trying to find an AI system that is amenable to those kind of like dynamic situations is the toughest part, right? There's no ability to build a static nav mesh or do any kind of scoring in a static way, or even test the AI in a reasonable way in all these situations. And so I think procedural generation makes it a challenge to produce a flexible AI that can deal with all of those situations.
It's interesting when you see that a lot of the kind of AAA video game development is very much focused on building simple, robust AI that works in very specific contexts, but there's always these kind of pre-baked expectations of what that environment's going to look like, how that environment is going to allow for kind of ranges of interaction. The scope of that environment is often very clearly defined, and then there's maybe a little bit of wriggle room in there. And it's interesting because I'm actually dealing with this sort of thing right now for an unannounced project where you're now trying to take these kind of tool chains, and we're literally trying to look at kind of taking in tool chains that I'm familiar with, and then saying, right, can we get these to work in an environment that we don't know what it's going to look like every time? And one of the interesting things that what I'm finding at the moment is an element of player balance, and it really comes down to the type of game that you're trying to make. Like, sorry, not so much player balance, but kind of gameplay balance. And that, yeah, I've got a bunch of non-player characters. I can procedurally generate those characters, but I can also generate them in a procedurally generated world, and then that might not be fun. You could inadvertently create an experience where you don't ever actually interact with them, or they seem to have, there's really weird edge cases, as Brian said. There's all these like kind of really interesting circumstances. The floor is now lava, and they can't find a way to navigate around that. And even just building your navigation tools, like the smallest of things, just turns into this really big headache. And I think it's why, certainly with a lot of the bigger studios, like, they kind of refrain from going down this route, because the edge cases become so extreme, right, that you're going to have trouble like running. They have enough trouble as it is trying to get a game of that size and scope out to market. I think that the amount of extra quality assurance you'll have to go through to get that working, I think, could be a real problem.
That's great. So when it comes to AI testing, how does AI testing work in general, and how does trying to find these kinds of edge cases change when you're doing a PCG game and you have 10,000 options or 100,000 options, which you in some way should check, but clearly you can't check all of these things? And how does that kind of shift things from normal AI testing regimes?
I guess in Caves of Qud, we don't do a lot of formal structured QA. I know, like, Josh Gee for Cogmind, for example, has some pretty regimented automated test batteries that he runs the game through. But for Caves of Qud, we didn't go into it building something like that, and it's fairly hard to put that in after the fact. And our approach focuses on modularity, so that we can test individual behaviors apart from all of the others, and make sure that there's a way that they can syntactically combine, so that and we can talk about this a little bit more as we get into like what are some practical solutions for AI architecture in a sort of very dynamic environment. But one of the things we do is make sure that we've got behaviors that are well encapsulated from one another, that we can test, so that, if we add a new environmental object and it works in a certain circumstance with a certain set of actors, then it will work like that, irrespective of the other things that are surrounding it. And as long as it's designed in a way that what happens when it's interacted with is also modular, then you're able to get these sort of emergent behaviors from a bunch of tiny modules without worrying about necessarily testing all of the large possible network of interactions.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that 100%. I think the interesting element of that as well is that if you've got these kind of modular components and you're allowing for this emergent behavior, if you're giving that kind of freedom, I guess, then there's a greater opportunity for it to do more interesting things that you don't anticipate, right? And that you don't want it to, because you could ultimately limit it by being too strict or far too, adding too many constraints to that kind of testing process, that you could inhibit a really cool or interesting behavior that just is this weird combinatorial effect of so many modular systems being in play at once.
Yeah, one of Caves of Qud's sort of design tenets is that we try to allow everything that can happen and only restrict the most sort of heinous interactions. So we don't want to go into it saying, here are the 3 interactions we want to build, and restrict everything else. We say, well, we're sort of open to all the possible interactions, and we only shut down the ones that in practice become really deeply problematic. And in some cases, it allows the system to sort of contribute to designing itself, because you often get these interesting interactions that you didn't design explicitly that are very novel, right? Like, so it feels to some extent like those kind of emergent systems are contributing to their own development, just sort of stochastically.
Could you say a little bit about some of the problematic things that you kind of deliberately cut out of the game's AI?
Most of the things that end up getting cut out of the game's AI are cut out because they're not fun to interact with, right? They're too frustrating, or they sort of break a player's sense of immersion in the world. So if something is self-destructive, like, for example, we had AI that would wander around, as a very simple example, and we changed torches to give some heat to nearby objects, and we found that we had a cat walking around in the opening village who kind of liked to sit on the torches and would eventually self-combust and walk away and burn to death, which, that's not like a super believable interaction. And so what we did is we had the torches sort of add some navigation weight so that the cat would walk on them less. It is still possible for the cat to set itself on fire, which is awesome. We didn't want to completely restrict it, but we wanted it to be, sort of a rarer example of behavior than it happening every time somebody logged into the game, which was what was happening initially.
So that seems quite anecdotal. Is this coming from user feedback? Is this coming from players going, "Hey, look, I saw a cat sitting a torch," sort of thing?
Oh yeah, no, it absolutely is, right? We added the torches and we had the cat. I mean, we're a very small team. We're 2 developers, and there's a lot of possible interactions. And so what we tend to do is just not try to defend ourselves from all the possible interactions. And you'll see some people posting amusing videos of the cat setting itself on fire, and we're reactive to those negative experiences rather than trying to pre-design our way out of all the possible bad things that can happen.
Kind of also gives your community, I guess, an opportunity to kind of vet those interactions and sort of go, right, okay, well, that was cool.
Yeah, well, it's hard to tell sometimes what people's reactions are going to be. One of the other AI reactions that happens is that all of the characters in the game are generated with a random backstory. So they have certain events that manipulate their faction membership. So, people might be hated by a particular faction because they cooked a horrible meal for somebody that was a member of that faction, or they might be loved because they saved a village of that faction. What will occasionally happen in the opening city is that all of the villagers share a faction of the village, but there's a warden who generally protects the village. But sometimes when you start the game, the warden will immediately blast one of the NPCs to death with a cold ray, because of these randomly generated factions that makes one of the NPCs hated by wardens, right? And so that was surprising to us when it went in, but we left it in because it causes some dynamicism to the world, and it is a little funny interaction. It's a little funny introduction to the dynamic faction system, right? People will often come into the forums and post, "Hey, the warden killed this NPC. Is that supposed to happen?" And we sort of left it in as a introduction to the fact that there's dynamic faction membership.
Sounds like such a critical thing, though, that if you had that in another type of game, it would almost immediately be kind of stripped from it. Like you say, that there's this kind of dynamic element that you want people to kind of be aware of and accustomed of, and also be conscious that it could affect them. I remember, this kind of reminds me of the I'm trying to remember the name of the system. It was originally in the older builds of Skyrim, where they cut it out because the characters had agency, and they were literally discovering that entire towns were coming out dead because one character. So this was all because each character had its own beliefs, desired and intention models, and they decide they want to do something, and then they were doing playtesting, and it's kind of an urban legend now that apparently they were playtesting Elder Scrolls Oblivion, and questline characters were dead because some guy 2 towns over decided, I really want to craft this item, and the only person who's got the resource for it is this guy sitting in a cave somewhere. And so they'd go all the way over there and just stab the guy, and then after this playtester had been playing it for 20 hours, I can't proceed in the main storyline anymore because this guy's dead.
Yep. Well, I mean, that's exactly the kind of interaction that happens in Caves of Qud, and we sort of lean into it because the world has a sort of absurdist flair, and also because the kind of game, we want to compete with games like Skyrim, not by being the most well represented world, from a believability standpoint, but by allowing those kind of somewhat absurdist interactions that happen from time to time, right? Which like you say, AAA games can't afford to do. And so this gives people a place to come in and interact with a world where those kind of anchors are taken off, right? That we allow some of these, kind of borderline cases where, it may be disruptive to people's gameplay to happen.
So why do you think it is that AAA games are less inclined to allow these kinds of edge cases or these kinds of strange but still within world interactions?
I think I'd put it down to because they typically have a very defined scope. That there's a marketing message. I mean, in a sense of I'm sounding a little bit cynical with it, but sometimes there's a very specific marketing message or experience that they're trying to craft behind that. And anything that goes off message, if you will, I think can sometimes be a threat, I guess. Particularly, I mean, not so much prevalent now, but certainly a few years ago with like licensed properties. But also you've got these big brands now, I guess, whether it's like the Assassin's Creeds and Call of Duties and stuff like that. So they're trying to, retain some sort of core identity to that, which is weird as well now that I think about it, because both of those games have went off and done weird offshoot things. But yeah, it seems that there's always a lot of them have a very linear kind of path within that experience, and they want it to adhere to that, I guess.
I think it also comes down to risk aversion, right? I mean, ultimately these guys are spending a lot of money, and they have a lot of executives in control of that money that reasonably want to reduce the risk around the project, right? And allowing these kind of out-of-bound interactions increases the overall risk profile of the project, and they would rather spend that risk in other places, right? Which is reasonable. I don't think that it is the most successful. You can look at games like Shadow of Mordor with a Nemesis system, games like XCOM, which do start to allow these kind of emergent interactions in a AAA context being very successful, right? So I think that there's room in AAA to start allowing more emergent interactions from procedural systems that will, require AI interaction, and I think there will be some successful players that do it. I just don't. Nobody has really leaned into it all the way, and so nobody's willing to be the first to stick their nose out in a AAA space where you're spending, $80 or $100 million on a game.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Certainly, Shadow of Mordor and XCOM are really good examples of that. The thing that I find weird is I haven't played it yet, but certainly like the new entry in that series was Shadow of War. It doesn't seem to have embellished in a kind of the more granular aspects of the character interactions and systems. It just seems as if the whole thing's been made bigger because they're in that kind of scope. You have that budget. You can just, all right, that was cool, we're going to make this whole system bigger. It's not struck me yet, maybe I'm wrong, but they haven't made it a more nuanced system to allow for more kind of meaningful interactions.
I guess thinking about it a little more, some games, especially the kind of immersive open world sims that I like to play, like Dishonored or BioShock or Prey recently, they don't have procedurally generated levels, but they do have a lot of dynamic content inside the levels that the player can interact with. So I might be able to place turrets in different places. I might be able to, affect the world with certain weapon or equipment, and the AI has to react reasonably to that. And I think games like Prey and Dishonored, like particularly the Arcane games and the Deus Ex games, do a remarkably good job of having the AI interact with the player in a dynamic way. And one of the things I would personally love to do is take some procedural level design into those kind of immersive sims, right? I mean, to be able to replay those kind of environments in a procedural way.
Yeah, that was definitely something which always struck me about both BioShock and about Deus Ex, the way that you can use mines and turrets and traps and various weapons and various guns and so forth, and the AI will always, within fairly sort of broad parameters, it will always respond in a fairly sane way to these kinds of things which the player can kind of set up. But I wanted to go back to something which you just mentioned, Tommy, about Shadow of War, which is you said that that you felt that there could have been far more kind of detailed and far more kind of granular interactions with the system in that game. Could you say a little more about kind of what you think they could have added and how it would have changed the kind of AI plus PCG aspects of that game?
So I mean, I actually only just finished Shadow of Mordor like about a month ago, if I remember right, and I mean, I think to some extent, what I think about it is got a small kind of disclaimer written on it, because ultimately I think the biggest problem, if you want to call it, that Shadow of Mordor's Nemesis system has is it takes place in the Lord of the Rings universe. Because everything's related to orcs, right? Or Urukai, or I can't remember, Uruks, I can't remember the name, the particular term. There's going to be like a Lord of the Rings fan who's listening to the show who's going to be really angry at me. But the whole, that system seemed to revolve around two things: developing a relationship in which you have kind of like three things: terrified an Uruk to the point you then kill them. You've been defeated by an Uruk, and then they have this kind of they're incredibly antagonistic towards you, but also they like to rub it in your face that they've defeated you before. And then in the latter half of the original game, which I think is a big part of the new one, is you can enslave them. Essentially, you brand them and you make them your own. And that the latter half, particularly the branding, I thought was really cool, because it began to expose how the Nemesis system works. This kind of procedurally generated set of stories that were emerging as a result of a mission being constructed in the game world, and the system picking two characters that would fit for that particular story at that point in time. And that's how it works in the front half. And then in the latter half, when you're able to you're branding these characters and saying, right, you're mine now, I want you to go and kill that guy, I'm going to send you out on an assassination hit. You then see those missions actually being constructed by your own action, which I thought was great. The thing is that you never really develop any relationship with the characters that you've branded, and like I always thought maybe something along the lines of finding ways to bolster their abilities. I think Mass Effect does stuff like this, where you had, like, I think Mass Effect 2 was big on it, where you would do companion missions to kind of help people out with their own thing. And one of the big things that Shadow of Mordor really prides itself in is that each of these characters has strengths and weaknesses that can be exploited during play. Maybe they're scared of fire and they get enraged when they see this particular thing. They're invulnerable to this or that. And you think, well, maybe you could have actually taken the weediest and kind of weakest and poorest of all of these Uruk, and then take him into your wings, sort of thing. Is I'm going to bring you up, and then allow for you to train them, because I felt that while you developed a really strong emotional connection to the people you were trying to kill, you never really developed a strong relationship with the ones that you brought onto your side. And maybe even running like training missions with them, that if there was a possibility it would increase a stat somewhere, or it would negate or remove a weakness or something like that. Like having those kind of aspects of their character be more dynamic. I think that would have been really cool to see, because it then allows for this kind of a stronger personal attachment, I guess. I think that's what I really wanted. I wanted that kind of that XCOM feeling I get with my squads to emerge with the kind of the Uruk army I was raising in Shadow of Mordor.
I agree. I would really like an orc dating sim.
I didn't even think of that. That'd be great. Just send them out to go and do, like, kind of have a bromance or a romance or whatever.
So, Brian, have there ever been aspects of the AI in Caves of Qud which you wanted to work in there, but which you felt or which you found would simply be too hard to make work alongside the game's PCG systems?
The biggest limitation for me right now is scale. Right, I'd really like to be able to scale the game to do more large world simulative work, and I know you do some of that in URR, right, where you've got sort of abstract transport layers. And my architecture didn't support that from the beginning, and so it's really hard to build that in later, right? I would really love to be able to do things like have caravans traveling across the world and have NPCs be able to navigate across the space. And I don't have a higher tier transport layer, and running a bunch of zones at once gets a little heavy with Caves of Qud's architecture. So I think if I could choose one thing to pluck off the tree and get magically into the engine, it would be something like that.
Interesting. Yeah, since I've, as you say, UR has quite a bit of this in it, where all the characters are kind of abstracted out until the player comes close enough to them to make them physically spawn. They don't really exist and so forth, and they act in a kind of simpler version of what their AI would be if they had been physically spawned and the player was watching them at that point. And that's proven, from what I've heard from the feedback from the people who I've shown the code, the new version to, which is now 2.5 years in dev, and I will get it out eventually. But from folks who I've shown that to, it does seem to work fairly convincingly, I think, having people moving around this space, even when the player isn't watching them. But it definitely poses a lot of challenges where you're having characters make AI choices on one scale, where they are making choices in parts of the world which don't in fact exist at that point because the player hasn't been there to make them spawn. And then if you get and then you spawn it, the kinds of choices which they made before you as the player cause that region to exist, and the kinds of choices they make after, making sure that those kind of sync up, can be quite tricky, I found.
Yeah, it seems very difficult to build, in general. I think that as games evolve, I think that kind of technology will be some of the most interesting for me to follow, is tools that allow larger universes to be simulated. Because I think like local space AI is fairly well developed. I mean, you can go infinitely deep, of course, but games have explored static local AI, and I think very unexplored is the idea of simulating larger worlds in a believable way with the kind of difficulties in abstraction that you enumerated there.
And you mentioned also about the kind of gap between a simulated AI and a fun AI. And so I wondered, although clearly the example of the cat which will set itself on fire, that wasn't a realistic thing, but it still worked, but it still took place within the sim as it used to be. And so I wonder, do you think that there are realistic things within the sim which are also not fun, or is a realistic sim kind of a contingent part of making a fun sim, do you think?
I mean, in general, the AI acting truly realistically is not very fun at all, at least in the context of Caves of Qud. And that's true for a lot of games, I think. I think that, you kind of rely on a predictable AI, and an AI that will put itself in situations to be beaten, rather than an AI that is truly acting realistically. I mean, you look at something like Smart Kobolds, right? And when you're fighting a truly smart AI, it can be really frustrating, especially against the tendency to put a player against a bunch of monsters. And so, in fact, the AI is not very realistic at all. I could go on, but I think that summarizes my point, right? Like, I think that what people want is a feeling of authenticity, and that doesn't mean realism. And an authentic feeling game is sort of like a power trip for the player, and one that they can model in their head. And that model, like a model that you can fit entirely in your head for the behavior of creatures, is often much simpler than a realistic one would be.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Like, this authenticity that comes from understanding, like, there's a context that as a player you can process, right? That you're looking at this character and you're seeing its behavior, and sure, it maybe doesn't makes sense in the wider world, but you understand why it does the things it does, and you also understand what effect, whether it be positive or negative, that's going to have on your gameplay and how you're going to interact with the world in turn, I think. And so, yeah, I think it's perfectly valid for whatever it is to be a lot less intelligent, because 9 times out of 10, if we're using them as antagonists, you want to be able to get around it. And if you can't see those limitations in its behavior, you can't see that opening, then, that's it. I think that's when player frustration just really ramps up.
I mean, the other thing is sort of related, is people try to. There have been studies and papers and some book articles I've read where people try to make AI behave more or less intelligently, and the reality is that people will attribute intelligence to AIs that are acting randomly more often than they will AIs that are behaving in any sort of rational, intelligent way, right? They feel like those intelligent AIs are either cheating or stilted in some way. And in the same way that a lot of PCG systems tend to use the player apophenia, like their ability to read, intelligence into random systems, in the physical space, like you just put down items or you put down a history at random, and people will put two essentially random things together and make a story out of it. They do the same thing for random actions from AI. And so in Caves of Qud, the actions are often driven contextually. So the AI is not really making a decision for what to do. The AI is deciding, well, I want to attack something. And then it's just asking its whole inventory and the environment if there's anything that wants to attack this player, right? So if I have fire breath and I have a grenade in my inventory and nearby I have like a turret I could use, it just asks the things, hey, anybody want to attack the player? And then of those, it picks one at random and uses it. And players will attribute a great deal more intelligence to that system than actually exists.
Oh yeah, I mean, certainly when players are always really determined to kind of develop their own Markov chain, if you will, or kind of at least an element of understanding of what a system is doing by having a look at those actions in context. There's a really good talk, The Illusion of Intelligence. It was a GDC 2002 talk by 2 developers at Bungie. Hang on, I remember this off the top of my head because I literally was just talking about this a couple of days ago. Chris Butcher and James Grasimer. Don't know if they're still at Bungie anymore, but this was like 15 years ago. And they were talking about building the AI in the original Halo. And one of the things that came from that was that the things that they learned from playtesting was that a smart AI will appear tough, but a tough AI will appear smarter. And so they found that in playtesting, people actually thought that the characters were more intelligent by just giving them stronger health.
That's very interesting.
Because essentially they were able to see more of the different behaviors that those characters could commit. Now, I can't remember in Halo, I think it was hierarchical finite state machines they used in the original Halo, and then it's behavior trees in Halo 2 onwards. But yeah, like they had these kind of variety of behaviors, and it seemed like, oh right, they can absorb more damage, they can do more damage, and we're seeing more of the different kind of faculties that it has. Oh, it must be smarter now. You must have made it smarter. And they're like, nah, we just took the health point bar and just doubled it.
Yeah, well, if we're talking in the context of PCG, I think that you just named 2 very common techniques, right? Behavior trees, finite state machines that work very poorly in a complex PCG environment.
Yeah.
Because you can't hand code those kind of things to respond to all the possible ramifications. And I think that's one thing that prevents AAA from interacting with PCG environments, is that AAA is very invested in techniques that work very well in designed spaces, right? Like behavior trees and finite state machines, and are not very well invested in tools that work in procedural environments, right? Like Inversion of Control, right? Like Sims does it, right? Sims has essentially procedural environments that the player is creating for the AI that are not truly deeply procedural, but have the same effect, where the AI is put into a dynamic environment that is either like a nice house or like a murder place where people are drowning people in swimming pools, right?
What kind of person would do that? Unimaginable.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure nobody on this call has ever drowned us in a swimming pool. But the effect is the same. These AI have to act in a syntactical way in a dynamic environment, and Sims uses like inversion of control, same as Caves of Qud, where the environment drives the AI versus rather than the other way around. And so I think that AAA's over experience in some set of techniques and under experience in others probably additionally drives their unwillingness to delve into PCG environments.
Yeah, like funnily enough, actually thinking of Sims 4, I remember seeing a talk from Peter Ingebretson, who used to be working at, Artificial Intelligence for Interactive Digital Entertainment conference over in the United States. This would have been about 3 years ago, and he was talking specifically about all the constraint-based multitasking they had to do in Sims 4, because as you say, they have to create these characters that can respond to these kind of very procedurally crafted environments. Like, players have a tremendous amount of agency in what those worlds look like, and so they'd kind of built this kind of flexible, data-driven framework for it to execute an interaction based around constraints, so that they seemed more realistic. And it seemed like it was a knock-on effect from when they were at Sims 3. Simple things like if you've got a character trying to I think, what was the example? Like, read a book and eat cereal. So they'd be sitting at a table and they'd take 2 spoons of their cereal, they'd put the cereal down, then they'd pick the book up. Then they put the book back down, they'd go back to the cereal. And it would kind of alternate like this. And so they were like, well, but these are 2 interactions that the character could conceivably do at the same time. So can we find a way to kind of embed that in a kind of data-driven sense? I think there was also kind of weird spatial problems they had to deal with. For example, if you were going in to sit down in your like restroom, your living room, and watch the television, it tried to encourage you to pick a chair that actually would allow you to look directly at the television. Because sometimes they would sit like sort of perpendicular to the television. And it's like, well, I'm technically looking at the television because the television's within my line of sight, within this kind of view cone that they had. It's like, yeah, but you could have just sat on the 2-seater that's facing it. And,
yeah, see, that's really fascinating to me, because those are all, the exact kind of problems you would want to solve in a PCG environment.
Right? Yeah. So I don't know where else they went with it, but it was one of these things. Like, I hadn't played Sims, I think, since like the first one, and then it was like, oh, I want to play this now. This looks really interesting. How many really complex situations? How many bits of multitasking can I get you to do?
So you spoke a little bit there about finite state machines and also behavior trees. Could you maybe kind of tell us a little bit more about what about how those systems work and why they don't work all that well for PCG games?
Right. So, kind of brief overview. So, a finite state machine is essentially a system where you have a collection of states that kind of represent context for what you want a character to be doing, whether you want it to be idle, you want it to be patrolling an area, and you have events or like stimulus that will cause a transition from one particular state to another. And within those states, you might have specific behaviors that you want to execute. Now, a lot of the time, those are very handcrafted and quite refined behaviors. And I think the biggest problem that would actually come from that in trying to create it to operate within a procedurally generating context, and the same applies for behavior trees, is that you need to have this kind of data-driven approach of embedding useful information about every object in the world, and then have all that procedurally generate in. But then there has to be, all that information has to be parsable in some useful context to allow for the characters to do something interesting. Like, certainly when you see a lot of AAA games like to use those sort of techniques, they have blackboard systems where they're storing large amounts of information about the game world and its current within proximity of the player. So they're scooping up everything about all these interactable objects, maybe pulling down real-time data about enemy characters and stuff like that. And I don't think it's impossible to do. My voice went up a wee bit too high there. I don't think it's impossible to do, certainly. I think that there's just a large amount of authoring required. And yeah, I think that comes back to the kind of dynamic, flexible nature of generative systems of, are you going to be able to encapsulate for all these things? And are subsequently, are you going to end up constraining the types of things you can generate based on the metadata that you expect your system to be able to parse? And yeah, I mean, essentially, behavior trees are sort of a similar. They suffer from a similar kind of problem, I guess, in this context. Although their application, they're kind of considered as a nice alternative to finite state machines, because finite state machines, the bigger they get, the more difficult they are to debug, and the more difficult it is to spot weird edge cases in their behavior. So behavior trees, as their name implies, is intended to be more like a tree structure where you can dive down into particular sub trees which have specific aspects of the behavior. And a lot of these big AAA games like to turn them on and off, I guess. And so they'll have specific behaviors active at certain points in time. And I think it does come back to that kind of pulling interesting information out of the world and storing it in a way that allows for the character to then utilize that. And subsequently, I guess it comes down to the expectations of what that generative system's going to make. Can you then build a behavior tree that's going to respond to it?
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add, because my experience with behavior trees in particular is pretty limited, since most of the work in Caves of Qud is inversion of control stuff like Sims.
Mm-hmm. So this term that you just used, inversion control, could you describe a little about kind of how that works and what it is, and how it differs from those other two AI types?
Yeah, I mean, there may be a better term. Maybe Tommy knows one, but in my head, it may have come from early papers on The Sims where they talk about inversion of control, and that is to say, when you think about an AI doing stuff, because of the way you work as a human, you tend to imagine, a being with central agency looking around and then deciding to do something and then going off and to interact with the environment. And inverting control is about the environment reaching out and using an actor. In a simple way, you could imagine a games like Saints Row. They have big, complicated environments. Big cities you can wander around in an open world. And a very simple example is, in those kind of games, they will have a location where there might be a broom and a piece of sidewalk that can be swept. And an AI doesn't decide to pick up the broom and sweep the sidewalk. Rather, the broom will reach out and grab an AI and inject a broom sweeping animation into it, which can result in things like it grabbing a horse and accidentally having a horse play the broom sweeping animation or whatever. But in a very simple way, it's about objects in the environment using actors rather than actors using objects in the environment. And that becomes a very powerful way to create encapsulated behavior. So that if we add, like, say, a hookah to a hookah tent in Caves of Qud, rather than trying to program the AI to know how to smoke a hookah, we rather think of it as having the hookah understand what entities might be able to smoke it, and have the hookah able to drive entities to perform that action. And the same thing is true for combat interactions. Like, you could imagine, like, it's more that wings are able to grab a creature and make it flying than it is a creature has any clue that they can fly. Because in Caves of Qud, smoking a hookah, a creature might just broadcast a bored state. I just want to do a passive behavior. And anything in the environment will then respond and say, okay, well, I have something for you to do. You're going to walk over here and smoke this hookah. And the character itself has only ever said, I'm bored, I want to do a bored interaction, or I'm in combat, I want to do a ranged interaction. And the actual AI, like, brain component of Qud is basically just a set of those broad high-level desires. I want to attack something, or I'm bored and I want to do a passive behavior. And then everything in the environment gets thrown in a bag, and they pick one of those out. Okay, I'm going to smoke a hookah, or I'm going to wander around and harvest this apple because the apple tree told me to. Does that make sense?
Totally, yeah.
Also, I guess that makes it incredibly, but not incredibly easy, but much easier to scale that up then, because you're essentially allowing these interactable elements to define the behavior systems.
Yeah, well, one of the goals of Caves of Qud was that we knew we wanted to have this very large world filled with lots of different interactions, and we wanted adding a new interaction to the world to be a linear process, right? So that the first new kind of object or the first new kind of item behavior was about as complicated to add as the 5,000th new kind of environmental object, because we're not going to be able to compete with a game like Saints Row or BioShock or Skyrim for fidelity graphically or visually. And so if we're going to compete in any kind of way, we need to compete in terms of world complexity, the interest of interactions, the density of those interactions. And so we wanted to be able to do 10,000 of them rather than 20. And so that requires some kind of architecture that allows that kind of linear additive technology. And so we use an entity component system. We've talked about that in other places. And the technique we used for the AI was this inversion of control. So when I add a hookah, nothing else in the world knows about hookahs, right? Only hookahs know about hookahs. And so when we add a new item, like a bedroll that you can sleep in, we've added this new object. It's just as complex to implement as the hookah, right? It knows how to reach out and interact with things when they're bored and make them sleep in a bedroll. But it's a linear chunk of testable behavior, right? And it can be if it's accidentally reaching out and making horses sleep in a bedroll, okay, we can fix that in the bedroll. But we haven't touched horses, and when we add a new kind of creature, it doesn't have to know anything else about the environment, right? Those environmentals will hopefully have been coded in a way that asks same questions about things like, does this have a brain? Then it can sleep. If it doesn't, it can't, right? Does it have like 4 legs? It probably doesn't want to sleep in the bedroll, otherwise it might. And so it allows us to add interactable, AI tools in the game with a linear complexity. And it's been very successful. I'm pretty happy with it in general.
Have you run into any issues with that kind of system at all?
The main issues are ones of unintended interactions, right? We've talked about the cat. Places where we have to add some new thing to the system, and it doesn't properly take into account some other interaction, and so you get weird results, right? But other than that, it's been pretty successful. One of the problems with the Caves of Qud system and that kind of system in general is it's a little hard to get prescriptive behaviors. So if you want to have like a cutscene play out, it's kind of hard to tell all the objects to stop reaching out and grabbing people because they're involved in some other kind of scripted behavior. And so it's very good for procedural dynamic interactions. But as soon as you want to say, well, I want this very specific thing to happen, it can be hard to get the AI to behave, right? Because you have this big world that's trying to interact with the actors, and so they go off and do their own thing and mess up your scripted behavior.
Interesting. What kind of solutions have you found to that, or have you just kind of chosen, okay, we'll have no tightly scripted actions here?
I haven't found a clean solution that isn't just basically hackily, very heavy-handedly grabbing control of an actor, sometimes completely shutting down their AI behavior and replacing it with a completely new component that just drives them, right? Which has its own problems. I don't know if there's a clean solution. There probably is, but I certainly haven't discovered it. The solutions I've found are very heavy-handed.
What's kind of interesting about that is it sort of ties into, certainly from my own reading, that when you look at, I think this might actually be why we were coming back to this point earlier about trying to get well-known AI techniques to try and work in procedural context, is because a lot of AAA development has moved away from exactly what you were suggesting there. The notion of even finite state machines has gradually moved away. I talked about them a little bit earlier. They're not as popular as they once were. It tends to be more now behavior trees, and also another thing called hierarchical task networks, which is a form of planning technology. And both behavior trees and HTNs are very useful at building macro layers of behavior. So you're actually beginning to encode specific total order or a partial order to a sequence of behaviors that you want. If you go back to the likes of early Halo, but even I think Fear, which is often a game that everyone likes to talk about for its great AI, those games were very much built around behavior oriented. They were very reactive in nature, so they always had very limited behavior, and then it would make another decision at that point about what's the next behavior to do. So whereas the inversion of control, you're kind of free to do whatever you want, and you let other objects then poll to say, "Hey, come and do something over here because you're free. Run this interaction with me." That seems to be going in the complete opposite direction from where a lot of these kind of bigger AAA games are going, because the designers want to have a greater sense of control and how to manage what that character is going to do for the next 30 seconds to 2 minutes. And so hence this kind of transition over to BTs and HTNs, because now this idea of I can encode it on a macro level of 5, 10, 15 actions I want to have within this kind of the scope of a very particular behavior I want, and then it will play them out differently depending on the particulars of that environment at that point in time.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some strong technical tension there between designers wanting to have a large degree of control over these scripted behaviors, right? To have them be, really beautiful, because they're often wrapped around expensive animations and things that people want. A very precise look. They don't want them clipping through the wall. They want, they want a very beautiful interaction every time, and so they want a lot of control. And you give up a lot of that when you start having dynamic interactions. And so, I think we're still a long way from finding a good system that is able to serve both those needs, right? To be able to say, hey, I want to give you a very narrow scripted channel for this particular behavior. B, I want you to be able to have these long-running sequences that solve some constraints and perhaps, end up performing these actions in a particular order, but you can also do other things in between. Or C, I want you to sort of free roam the world in a believable way in a dynamic environment, right? Those right now are completely different techniques that I don't think anybody's really successfully fused into any kind of unified system.
So what are some of the upsides of FTNs compared to the other techniques?
So the big thing with the HTN approach is that
HTN, sorry.
Yeah. So HTNs, hierarchical task networks. It's I guess the big thing for it is that behavior trees tend to be these kind of very, very prescribed sets of these data structures where we have a very particular set of behaviors that will always be certain subtrees, and you have certain conditions on whether they can run and how they operate, etc. The interesting thing is if you actually take a fully grounded hierarchical task network plan and put it next to a behavior tree, it actually looks really similar. And that, I guess, is the real kind of draw of them, is it's essentially dynamic behavior tree construction. But you lose that, like you see, you like we were saying a minute ago, that you lose that total that total control. But at the same time, you can actually do an awful lot with that, and you can allow for kind of these really rich sets of kind of long-term behaviors. It seems like it's been a gradual transition towards it. I mean, it started out like Killzone 2, I think, was one of the first games to do it, and it's slowly now kind of permeating throughout kind of AAA development. I just saw a talk last month where I believe it was I think both Halo Wars 2 and Horizon Zero Dawn have moved towards this approach because they found it worked really well in those particular contexts.
Interesting. So we do now, of course, live in a world where the new Go AI has trained itself on Go and beat the old Go AI and so forth, and we read a lot about how this is the most important AI thing in history. So I wanted to ask you both, A, do you think that the kind of work that DeepMind does has a lot of importance or a lot of potential future impact for video games? And if not, where do you think the future does lie?
Oof, it's a big one.
Well, I can go. I followed the Go games pretty intensely because it was really fun to watch, and I enjoyed the commentary. I think their systems, they obviously are highly advanced, but they also show that the kind of dichotomy we're talking about, where you have this high-level planning and then you have low-level sort of scripted tactics, is something that still is not completely solved, because they have multiple systems. They have sort of a strategic layer and they have a tactical layer, and they work together to solve the Go game. But I don't think anyone would call that problem solved, even at this highest level, right? I mean, and maybe the eventual answer is that those are just always completely separate systems, even in a human. I think that those techniques are obviously using a lot of power, but I think can guide the idea that there are these kind of hierarchical ways to think about an environment, right? You can think about it strategically at a high level, to think about a particular AI's long-term goals and the order in which it wants to accomplish it, and the way that it thinks about the scoring of those things. And then there are systems that, given a particular goal, might take a very tactical kind of scripted approach to, like a particular Joseki or whatever. And so I clearly that shows that it can be successful. I think that you can take that kind of structure and apply it to games well at a high level, though I don't know if that technology is ever going to be applicable at a low level, because it is so processor intensive until computers are much more powerful than they are today.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what you're saying there, particularly the notion of the kind of the engineering solution of kind of looking at the kind of reactive level to the kind of long-term strategic level. I mean, I also watched quite a few of the games with great interest, and I think that it's going to take a while before that sort of thing becomes immediately palatable to commercial video game development, though not entirely. There's already some of that actually exists. So the GoBot, the Alpha GoBot, that relies on recurrent neural networks to do the board analysis, because that's the kind of the how good is the current state of the board for me right now? Am I in a good place? Am I in a bad place? And then it uses Monte Carlo tree search, if I remember right, to then actually do the action selection. Now, Monte Carlo tree search already exists in games such as the Total War series. They've been using it since Rome 2 for campaign AI, if I remember correctly. It's one of the things, certainly something I've been observing for a long time now, being in the academic space, is that we've always had this kind of penchant for really cool machine learning algorithms and going, look at this, it can play Pac-Man, or look at this, it can play Super Mario Brothers, or now it's look at this, it can play Go. Like when I started, it was Pac-Man. We get so excited about this, like kind of 15, 20 years ago. And what's gradually happening is they're becoming faster, and they're not as processor intensive. The deep learning, I think, is going to be the big hiccup. How could you get something like that to work? Now, the other thing that I think is a little interesting is whether or not this is going to be useful in any context outside of purely adversarial. Because so far everything that they're looking at, so we've had AlphaGo, there's been the recent OpenAI thing with Dota 2, where they've been competing one-on-one. They say that they're able to beat everybody one-on-one, but already like human players were finding gaps in its behavior. And as well as now StarCraft, the StarCraft 2 AI API is now opening up as well. Now, I think that these things will probably reach their apex when they can actually prove that they can beat StarCraft 2 and they can beat teams at Dota. I think one-on-one on Dota, I kind of shrugged at that a little bit, not to be dismissive of the work they've done. Like, it's really impressive that they got it working that quickly. But I thought, well, yeah, of course you're going to be able to beat a human one-on-one. Like, this is, a lot of it's purely reactive at this level. There's not really any kind of long-term strategic tactical behavior. That's when it's, get them to beat an entire human team at Dota 2, and then I'll be worried. But what I'd like to see is, can we start using these tools in non-adversarial contexts? Can you have it as a co-creator, like as a kind of computationally creative system to do your procedural generation, for example? What if it's working with you to do something interesting? What if it's trying to make your world more fun, like kind of tying it into director AI systems and stuff like that? Like, can I make this open world more fun or more interesting, or trying to make it more engaging for the player at real time by actually assessing what's happening in the world and then using those kind of tools and technologies rather than just trying to find, a much smarter way to kill us?
Right. I mean, that's a completely different dimension of AI that we haven't touched on at all, almost a second show, because ultimately, when you ask what is PCG, right? PCG are machine systems that are built to be artificially intelligent, right? To create these worlds as a human creative would, often fed by human input. But ultimately, I think in the best systems, those lines are going to blur, right? Like, the idea that you have a physical world built by PCG systems, and then you have a narrative structure that PCG systems might build. And right now, a lot of the AI acts on its own. You've got a goblin that has individual desires, but if you play a game like Dungeons and Dragons, the actions of the individual characters are driven not just by personal need, but by narrative need, right? And the same is true of the world. And I think ultimately, long term, you start to see the lines blur between individual AI and the PCG of the narrative and the PCG of the world, so that the behaviors selected for the individual characters serve world and narrative needs as well, right? And that is just brand new space that we are just picking at the very edges of a huge frontier of, I think.
Yeah, there's some work that certainly I know in the academic space where they're kind of looking into these, particularly like narrative generation, and this notion of, if I've got we've got actors, we've got a narrative arc that we need to complete, and then how are we more flexible or dynamic in trying to reconcile particular aspects of that story with constraints that we have, but also factoring player agency in there. I saw a really good talk about this once. I think it might have been Justice Robertson, who used to be at North Carolina. I think he was at North Carolina State, if I remember right. Oh, he's going to tell me off if I'm wrong. But they were talking about stories like, imagine you had a character, trying to complete a quest, and the wizard's like, oh, you need to come and speak to me so that you can get the spells, and I tell you what the plot is or whatever, and you're like, screw that guy, I'm away off to go and do something else. Like, but the story's not really happening. Like, the player's narrative is growing, but the larger plot isn't. Does the wizard come back and go, dude, like, I'm here. You need to come and talk to me. He's like, yeah, but I'm not. But look, it's really important you come and have a chat with me right now. Or do you find another way for the plot point that character was going to bring to you? Do you move that into another way? Oh, like, you then bump into the wizard, but he's dead. And he's left something in the ground, and you go, oh, look, dead guy. Oh, that's the guy from earlier. Oh, I'll pick this thing up. Oh, that's useful. And away off you go. Or I think there was another example, like you create a story where it's, typical damsel in distress sort of idea, where the knight in shining armor is going to rescue the princess from the dragon, but somewhere during the second act, the dragon gets killed by the princess because she gets fed up waiting on you. So how do you then work your way out of that? And it was this idea of having these generative systems go, well, what if we just, what was the key constraints? You have to save the princess, you have to slay the dragon. And in that model, certainly, I mean, that's not necessarily saying that's the only way that story can end, but that was how that example played out. What if the princess is then cursed and turns into a dragon? And this was like one possible output of that. And I think moving into that space, I think that's when things are going to get really interesting. If the worlds are being like, we've already able to build worlds to a certain degree of complexity, can we then find a way to mesh the narratives with it?
Well, that's fantastic. Thanks, guys. So I think we will wrap it up there, unless either of you have any kind of final comments about PCG and AI or anything else which we haven't really touched upon.
Nothing in particular. I think this was a fun talk. I think if nothing else, we ended on a point that showed just how vast the space is, right? I mean, we're peering into this, enormous frontier that we are only beginning to map, like one tiny corner outline of the edge of, and there's a lot of interesting stuff to come in the coming decades in this space.
Sums it up nicely, I think.
Perfect. In that case, we will call today there. Well, thank you to both of my guests, and thank you for listening to this episode. And if you did enjoy it, then please leave us a comment or a review on iTunes or something of that sort, and we'll be back soon with more roguelikey PCG talk. So, goodbye for now.
Bye.